Good afternoon, everyone. Minnesota Housing would like to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar on the Housing Tax Program and the 2021 Allocation Plan. My name is William Price, and I am the bond lead for the Multifamily Division, managing the Housing Infrastructure Bond Program and also 4% only tax credits. In today's session, we will provide a general overview of housing tax credits. We'll go over the 2021 Qualified Allocation Plan, which is our formal plan for the distribution of housing tax credits, and we'll outline the various upcoming engagement opportunities for local communities and stakeholders to dialogue with Minnesota Housing and our funding partners on how we can help advance local housing needs in your various communities. Before we get started, I'll walk through a couple of meeting logistics. So today's session will include an approximate 50-minute presentation and then 10 minutes for questions and answers. So questions can be submitted using the GoToWebinar tool, and we'll answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. If we aren't able to get through all of the questions within the hour, we will keep the session open for an additional 10 minutes for further questions to be submitted through the GoToWebinar tool. And then we will email out responses to all of the attendees. Also presenting with me today is Devin Pullman, Supervisor of Multifamily Programs. Devin will highlight the development of the 2022 QAP and the engagement opportunities available to influence and guide policy as we embark to develop the 2022 QAP. So for the GoToWebinar toolbar on the upper right hand of your screen allows you to ask questions using the questions feature, which is indicated with the orange arrow. At any time during the webinar, you can type your question and click the send button. You have two options for listening to the presentation, which is indicated by the blue box. You can listen through your computer using the mic and speakers, or you may listen through the telephone. You should have received the number and access code as a part of your webinar instructions. You can also find that information in the toolbar as well. I presume that since you're viewing this, you've probably already found the listening features and you can hear me. But if you can't hear me at any time during the webinar, please just type in a question in the chat section so we are aware of that as well. So handouts for this session have been emailed to those who registered and can also be found in the handouts section of the GoTo toolbar. That includes a copy of today's presentation and also a summary of approved content changes to the 2021 QAP. To get things off here, I'd like to start with the vision and mission of Minnesota Housing. The vision of Minnesota Housing is that all Minnesotans live in a safe, stable home that they can afford in a community of their choice. And that vision feeds into our mission that housing is the foundation for success. So we collaborate with individuals, communities, and partners to create, preserve, and finance affordable housing. And the QAP is a perfect example of that collaboration. Late last year, Minnesota Housing released its new 2020 through 2022 strategic plan, which will guide the agency's work over the next 3 years to go big so that everyone can go home. Over the next 3 years, we will pursue strategic objectives, including improving the housing system by focusing on people and places most impacted, especially children, creating and including an equitable housing system, and financing housing to support all areas of life. We will preserve and create housing opportunities by preserving existing housing and increasing new housing development and increasing access to rental assistance. We will support people needing services by effectively linking services to housing, preventing and ending homelessness, and supporting people with disabilities and also seniors. and we will work to strengthen communities that have been historically disinvested and support tribal nations and indigenous communities. The QAP and funding priorities of the consolidated RFP support the objectives outlined in the strategic plan. They work hand in hand together to achieve the broad goals that the agency has set forth. In this next section, I'll provide some background on the Housing Tax Credit Program and the purpose and history of Minnesota Housing's Qualified Allocation Plan. The Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, also known as HTC, is one of the principal federal mechanisms contained within tax law for the acquisition, substantial rehabilitation, and new construction of low-income rental housing. The HTC program provides tax credits to companies and individuals that invest in affordable rental housing, reducing their federal tax liability by the amount of tax credits for 10 years. In exchange for this reduction in tax liability, investors purchase the tax credits and agree to keep units affordable to households at certain income levels. In today's market, a dollar of tax credits sells for around 85 to 95 cents, depending on varying factors like location and area market analysis. The sales proceeds from the credits are then invested in new construction of affordable housing or acquisition and rehabilitation of existing properties. There are two types of tax credits, commonly referred to as 9% and 4% tax credits. Applicants who apply under Minnesota Housing's consolidated RFP may apply under a competitive process for 9% tax credits or for deferred gap funding with a 4% credit financial structure. Requests for 9% tax credits are typically 3 or 4 times greater than the amount of credits available. So that source is typically oversubscribed. Projects that have received an allocation of tax-exempt volume-limited bonds from Minnesota Management and Budget may apply for 4% tax credits through a pipeline process called 4% only. I'll further discuss the 4% option shortly, but first we'll focus on the 9% credit. Housing tax credits are an important source for creating and preserving affordable multifamily housing. Since 2012, when Minnesota Housing added geographic criteria into the QAP, over 10,900 units have been created with a combination of 9% and 4% tax credits. But the true impact of the program is in the affordability created for the individual or family. In the chart here, Minnesota low-income renters is defined as the median income of households with a gross annual income at or less than 60% of county area median income. The statewide median is further broken out between Metro and Greater Min, and you'll see that in the gray lines at the top. For units that Minnesota Housing currently monitors under the tax credit program, the median income of households in those projects are less than the statewide median for all renters. Thus, with tax credits, developments are able to provide housing solutions to communities and extend affordability to much lower income households. Minnesota Housing's annual 9% tax credit allocation typically funds anywhere between 12 and 15 affordable projects, representing 700 to 900 units typically. These tax credits are sold to investors and generate significant equity in the form of syndication proceeds for affordable housing. The total development cost of projects financed with competitive tax credits in the year 2019 was over $166 million. And tax credits are a very important component contributing to making those projects financially feasible. Per federal statute, 9% allocated to states based on a per capita formula. In Minnesota, state statute outlines rules regarding the tax credit program, including how tax credits are distributed. Significantly, statute establishes Minnesota Housing as the primary allocating agency, but it also establishes a number of cities and counties as tax credit ballots. The city of Minneapolis, the city of St. Paul, Dakota, and Washington counties have their own allocation process and their own qualified allocation plans. Each state receives a limited pool of 9% credits based on its population. Additionally, 9% credits have a higher applicable percentage than 4% credits, allowing for more bases to be captured and translating to more equity or syndication proceeds to the development. The fact that the 9% credits are limited and have a higher rate make them extremely competitive. Projects can apply for an allocation from this limited source during the consolidated RFP and also during round 2 of the tax credit allocation year. During the annual consolidated RFP, projects are able to apply for 9% credits and also can request deferred funding with a 4% tax credit structure, where Minnesota Housing issues tax-exempt volume limited bonds. As mentioned in the previous slide, 4% credits generate less equity or syndication proceeds than 9% credits. Thus, typically a development is left with a capital gap needing to be filled with a 4% credit structure. That gap can potentially be filled with funding sources from Minnesota Housing and our funding partners. Submitting a deferred request with a 4% tax credit financial structure along with a 9% tax credit request during the consolidated RFP is called a dual application, and more guidance is available on our website under the application resources. So projects can apply under this structure in the event that Minnesota Housing is the tax credit allocating agency. Alternatively, if a project lies within one of the previous suballocator jurisdictions, again, Minneapolis, City of St. Paul, Dakota, and Washington County, that jurisdiction also can agree to provide tax-exempt bonding in an amount sufficient enough to meet the 50% test for 4% credits. That project could then request deferred funding from Minnesota Housing. Prior to submitting an application, it is highly recommended to model the financial structure of a project as a 9% and as a deferred with a 4% financial structure, as many types of projects, including preservation, workforce, and even some supportive housing projects, may be able to support investor equity under both structures. So it's very important to submit a dual application during the RFP if the project can support equity under both structures, and therefore that increases the chances of a project being selected for funding. Minnesota Management and Budget is the primary apportionment agency for the allocation of tax-exempt volume limited bonds. These bonds, issued in an amount sufficient enough to finance at least 50% of the basis of development costs, allow a development to access 4% tax credits. In this 4% only process, upon receipt of the tax credits from Minnesota Housing, these projects are able to close, typically without needing additional deferred funding from Minnesota Housing. This process is called 4% only, and more information can be found on our website under the tax credit section. So 4% only is a little bit different from deferred with a 4% structure. Bonds are issued from a local issuer via Minnesota Management and Budget, and then the project comes to Minnesota Housing to request the 4% tax credits, or potentially to a sub-allocator if the project lies within one of those jurisdictions as well. Because tax credits are such an important financing tool, Minnesota Housing must have a plan for allocating the credits to developments, which is the Qualified Allocation Plan, also known as the QAP. The IRS requires every tax credit allocator to have a QAP, and there are certain IRS requirements about what must be included. For example, every allocator must provide preference for projects located in low-income areas that contribute to community revitalization. Minnesota Housing's QAP is made up of the QAP document, the Housing Tax Credit Procedural Manual, and the self-scoring worksheet. These documents in tandem detail the rules for how tax credits will be distributed throughout the state, what types of projects will be eligible for a set-aside of credits, how funding rounds will be administered, what rules and procedures applicants in Minnesota Housing must abide by, and what priorities will be used when considering what projects to fund. All applications are scored according to the priorities contained in the self-scoring worksheet, and then ranked based on that score. Every point claimed by an applicant on the self-scoring worksheet is a commitment that is memorialized in the 30-year or longer tax credit restriction. One of the first steps in planning for our QAP is to talk about how things worked the previous year. We consider what worked and what did not work in the most recent application round. We look at whether any criteria are having adverse or unintended consequences, whether we had difficulty scoring any criteria objectively, and how we can enhance the project and the process for our partners. We track these questions throughout the year as applications are scored. In addition to a backward look at how the previous QAP worked in implementation, we're also taking a forward look at what is on the horizon. We examine our agency's strategic plan and how that should cascade down into our QAP, and we look at emerging needs in communities around the state. We also continuously look for alternative, improved ways to define our criteria by examining national best practices. We also incorporate community feedback from comments that we received throughout the year from developers and other stakeholders, including comments we get from our regional housing dialogues, as well as a series of smaller focus groups. Lastly, we solicit formal public comments following publication of the proposed QAP through both written comments and a public hearing, which takes place after Minnesota Housing's Board of Directors approves the proposed QAP changes. This thorough process helps ensure that we meet the on-the-ground needs of communities. As we develop the QAP each year, we also revisit comments made in the previous years. So now we'll move specifically to the details of the 2021 QAP. So development of the 2021 QAP included a more robust stakeholder engagement process, including 2 rounds of public comments and an in-person session for open dialogue on proposed changes. Key topics emerged from this engagement that were compelling, supported important policy objectives of the agency, and led to several focused changes to the 2021 QAP. The QAP defines strategic policy thresholds, and proposals typically meet multiple priorities to score and compete well in the competitive funding round. The QAP priorities are to serve people with the greatest needs, largest barriers, fewest choices, and lowest incomes, to support community and economic development and promote housing in areas of opportunity, preserve existing subsidized and federally assisted housing, use scarce resources efficiently, and finance high-quality buildings. These priorities help ensure that the allocation of credits meet policy goals of the tax credit program and also Minnesota Housing's strategic plan. Scoring of these proposals is then based off of the selection categories that are outlined on the next slide. These 7 selection categories encompass the overarching scoring categories within the QAP. Within each selection category are individual scoring criteria. Starting with the greatest need, tenant targeting includes points for large family housing, permanent supportive housing for high priority homeless households, alignment with units targeted to continuum of care household priority types, be it youth with children, youth singles, single adults, or families with children, and also people with disabilities. Serves lowest income category for long durations includes points for restricting 50% of the units to households with incomes at the county 50% HUD MTSP income limit, points for project-based rental assistance, in addition to points for further restricting units to households whose incomes do not exceed 30% of MTSP income limits for a 10-year period. And developments may opt to extend the long-term affordability of the project to as much as 40 years. The next category is increasing geographic choice, which includes points for developments located in areas of economic integration, or if the project meets the definition of an economically integrated project with at least 25% of the units, but no more than 80% of the total units as assisted low-income units. Also included in this category is access to higher performing schools, the question of whether a project meets the definition of a workforce housing community. This category also includes a location efficiency, where we include maps of the 7-county metro area, urbanized and more urban areas in greater Minnesota with 50,000 or fewer residents in population, and also rural and small urban areas with populations less than 50,000. Community and economic development. In this category, developments contribute to a community development initiative. Points are also available for eventual tenant ownership. Additional points are available if the project meets the rural tribal designation areas, if the project is in the qualified census tract or meets tribal equivalent area location definitions, if the project meets a minority-owned or woman-owned business enterprise requirements, where a project sponsor, executive director of a nonprofit, general contractor, architect, or management agent is a minority or woman-owned business enterprise. The next category is preservation, where a project must meet one of the eligible risks of loss, which can include market conversion, critical physical needs, or ownership capacity, with further points and priorities for developments with existing federal assistance or other critical affordable units at risk of loss. The next category is efficient use of resources or financial leverage. In this category, we measure the financial readiness of a project, including committed capital sources, non-capital contributions such as land donations or fee write-down or waivers. Also included in this category is a percentage measurement of intermediary fees, and also the potential for a project to take points for cost containment. Lastly, for the building characteristics category, points are available if a project meets criteria under universal design and also for smoke-free buildings. Next, I'll go into a little detail over the key changes in the 2021 QAP that you should be aware of. For strategic priorities, we recognize the competitive nature of 9% tax credit projects and the significance of 4% tax credit projects financed through the issuance of tax-exempt volume limited bonds. As a result, the following additional strategic priority has been approved: that tax credit projects that meet the required minimum point threshold of 70 points for 9% tax credit projects are deemed to meet a strategic priority. For the state-designated basis boosts, developments that meet the triable strategic priority are now eligible to access the boost, in addition to supportive and preservation developments. Under the serves lowest income tenants and rent reduction scoring criterion, we eliminated the requirement that projects that take points for the 50% MTSP rents hold a project at those rents for a minimum of 10 years. And we increased the length of time that those rents are required to the duration of the LURA, or the Land Use Restrictive Agreement. So those 50% rents will be held for the entire term of the LURA. For rental assistance, currently projects that agree to provide project-based rental assistance are eligible for 3 different point categories. First, for having a percentage of units with committed project-based rental assistance. Second, for committing to provide that project-based rental assistance for a minimum of 10 years. And third, for further restricting a percentage of households to those whose incomes do not exceed 30% MTSP for a 10-year period. We have combined the first 2 categories into one and increased the total points for that category to advance the policy objective of serving more low-income households in tax credit projects for longer durations. A majority of projects with rental assistance have taken the additional points to pursue 10-year affordability. So that was kind of a real easy justification for us to make with that policy change, since that's what we typically see with projects taking points for rental assistance. We redefined areas of opportunity as increasing geographic choice, which reflects the intent of these geographies and recognizes that communities across the entire state of Minnesota can create opportunities for residents. For location efficiency, changes were made in 2 areas. First, developments can now achieve walkability points without needing to meet access to transit points, recognizing that there may be certain areas where walkability points could be achieved, but location efficiency points may be lacking. So we wanted to decouple those so that those specific projects would have the opportunity to achieve those points that were on the table. Second, we streamlined the rural and small urban areas with populations fewer than 50,000 criterion. First, we eliminated the requirement to submit documentation at the time of application that explains why the transit service available in a particular community is a viable transportation option. In the self-scoring worksheet, we linked to the Minnesota Department of Transportation's website that lists and provides links to transit service provider information by geographic location. Although we are still requiring documentation in the transit service, if the transit service is planned and not yet in operation. So this transit provider resource makes the need for additional documentation unnecessary. So instead of providing documentation, you could just simply link to the Minnesota Department of Transportation's website and provide documentation from there. Also, the requirement for demand response and dollar ride previously mandated no more than a 2-hour advance notice to achieve points. The new requirement for demand response and dollar ride allow for same-day service availability. So broadening the category there to ensure that all communities can potentially achieve those points. Additional approved changes include the Qualified Census Tract and Community Revitalization and Tribal Equivalent Areas, that's one criterion together. In recognition that communities across Minnesota, including those with higher percentages of households at lower income levels, benefit from tax credit investment, we increased the points in this category from 1 to 3. Minnesota Housing is also committed to advancing minority-owned and woman-owned business enterprise participation as a key component of the development process. Points for this criterion were increased from 3 to 4 for a project sponsor, executive director of a nonprofit, general contractor, architect, or management agent who is a minority or woman-owned business enterprise. For preservation, there are 2 streamlining changes and 2 policy changes. For the streamlining process, we eliminated the requirement that preservation projects submit a pre-application prior to the application deadline for round 1 and round 2 of tax credits. So the pre-application process is hereby eliminated. And we also eliminated the requirement that preservation projects must submit a dual application for tax credits in rounds 1 and round 2 if the development contains 40 or more units. So now preservation projects have the option of not submitting a dual application. From a policy perspective, we are creating 2 different tiers for existing rental assistance. The first tier includes federal project-based rental assistance or operating subsidies under a HUD, USDA Rural Development, or an HASDA, or other program that is not scheduled to sunset or expire. The second tier is updated to reflect projects with existing federal assistance as defined by public housing units, executed or converted under RAD 1, tax credit units, or rural development funded units without rental assistance, or existing federal assistance not captured in the first tier. The critical affordable units at risk of loss preservation criterion has also been updated to focus on housing with existing rent or income restrictions under a non-federal program, including those funded by state, local, or intermediary resources. For the efficient use of scarce resources and leveraged funds category, we provided further streamlining enhancements in 2 specific areas. For financial readiness to proceed and leverage funds, we provided clarifications for the documentation required for scoring purposes in the self-scoring worksheet for financial commitments. And for the other contributions category, again, those non-capital financial contributions, point tiers in this category were adjusted to provide more opportunity to achieve points for non-capital funding contributions. And we also eliminated the identity of interest exclusion of contributions from a part of the ownership entity as well. And lastly, under the building characteristics selection criteria, additional points are now available for projects that meet specified green communities criteria. In discussing the self-scoring worksheet, I would be remiss if I didn't outline the impact and the influence that local communities have in the process. Local communities have a significant role to play in positioning developments that address critical housing needs to be in the best position to receive financing from Minnesota Housing and our partners. This work begins at the early planning stages with local groups and in government committees and councils, where how a project meets local needs while also meeting the requirements and achieving Minnesota Housing strategic and selection priorities are key to meld together. For example, the Community Development Initiative is a strategic priority where active local planning and analysis of local housing needs amongst stakeholders is encouraged. Local communities can also influence selection priorities and how a project can compete in terms of points for 9% credits. For example, financial readiness incentivizes local funding commitments such as tax increment financing, other deferred loan awards such as home, and grants from nonprofits or charitable organizations that are then converted to deferred loans. Also, under other contributions, that category incentivizes non-capital funding commitments such as land donations or write-downs, local government reduction or waiver of project-specific costs, assessments, or even fees. And lastly, the location of the site can also factor into the points available for that site via the increasing geographic choice categories, where points are awarded for location efficiency, for transit access, and area characteristics that are captured in our community profiles, which I'll explain shortly. In all, local communities have a huge influence in terms of the viability of the project and its ability to be competitive in the 9% credit rounds. Over the next few slides, I'd like to give a few examples of recently funded projects that have received tax credits and the local influence that really brought those to fruition. Local housing leaders in Grand Rapids and Itasca County have demonstrated successful community partnerships to address housing shortages in the city. In 2016, after groundwork with Minnesota Housing Partnerships and Greater Minnesota Housing Fund's Joint Housing Institute initiative, leaders in this community opened Beacon Hill, a housing community combining supportive housing and family housing with the assistance of tax credits. This successful model and effective partnerships led to the development of a subsequent development project called Aurora Heights, which just received funding in the November RFP announcements. And this project will further address needs for affordable housing and supportive housing identified in local housing studies and market analysis. According to a Hennepin County report from July 2019, there were 674 single unsheltered adults. Beacon Interfaith Housing Collaborative has partnered with the Red Lake Nation to develop Mimosa, 48 apartment homes for members of the Native community who have experienced homelessness. Mimosa is an Ojibwe word that translates into English as "let's walk together." And the project will provide culturally relevant on-site support services in a location close to jobs, education, and transit options. And all those factor into point scoring as well. Utilizing tax credits, historic credits, and many deferred funding sources, this project will take a significant step in addressing homelessness in Minneapolis. Originally built in 1913, with its last rehabilitation in 1979, Colonial Square Apartments consists of 77 project-based Section 8 homes in Mankato. Meeting the preservation strategic priority, risk of loss, of critical physical needs, and the preservation scoring criterion, this rehabilitation will position the project to remain affordable for the long term. The city of Mankato prioritized the qualified census tract area that lies within their revitalization plan, and also committed funding, which helped the project achieve points under the Community Development Initiative and Financial Readiness Scoring Criterion. I'd like to switch gears here for illustrative purposes to show maps for location efficiency and location-specific maps. I'm going to show maps for the 7-county Twin Cities metro area, but there are also corresponding maps for Greater Minnesota found within the methodology documents located on our website. I'll give that link out shortly, but I'll just be using the metro area just for a point of reference here. So the first area of increasing geographic choice is economic integration. So with this map, economic integration points are available for the 7-county Twin Cities metro area, as well as areas in and around Duluth, St. Cloud, and Rochester. There are 2 scoring categories or tiers for economic integration. Tier 1, the highest scoring category for economic integration, represents census tracts where the median family incomes are in the 80th percentile for the region. Tier 2 of this category represents census tracts where the median family incomes are in the 40th percentile for the region. The next area of increasing geographic choice is with areas that have access to higher performing schools. Similar to economic integration, eligible areas for access to high performing schools include the 7-county Twin Cities metro area, as well as areas in and around Duluth, St. Cloud, and Rochester. An area has access to high performing schools if it is located in an area that has a higher than average performance on 2 of 3 indicators: The indicators include third grade reading, eighth grade math, and on-time high school graduation rates. The next geographic scoring criterion is workforce housing. Communities with a need for workforce housing are identified using data on the total jobs in the area, 5-year job growth in the area, or how many workforce workers commute long distances. Projects are eligible to receive 6 points if they are within 5 miles of a top 5 job center for the metro area, or if they are in a community that has added 500 jobs or more over the past 5 years. In Greater Minnesota, a project is eligible for 6 points if it is within 10 miles of a top 10 job center in Greater Minnesota or has added 100 jobs or more over the past 5 years. If a project is not in a community eligible for the 6 points under workforce housing, they still may be eligible to receive 3 points if it is considered a long commute community. Long commute communities are communities where 50% or more of the community's workforce travels 30+ miles into that community for work. Similarly to top job centers and job growth communities, a 5 and 10 mile buffer is applied around long commute communities to account for a modest commute shed. The location efficiency areas are based on a combination of access to transit and walkability. Given the wide range of transit service types across Minnesota, we have broken down this scoring criteria into 3 categories. They were mentioned before, but I'll detail them here. They are geographically defined as the Twin Cities 7-county metro area, Greater Minnesota with urban areas, and Greater Minnesota with rural and small urban areas. In the Twin Cities 7-county metro area, there are 3 scoring categories for access to transit. 7 points are available for projects located within a half mile of an existing or planned light rail, bus rapid transit, or commuter rail stop. 4 points are available for projects located within a quarter of a mile of a stop along Metro Transit's high-frequency network. And finally, 2 points are available for projects located within a quarter of a mile of regular weekday transit service or a half a mile of a park and ride lot. For Greater Minnesota urbanized areas, these include areas with populations greater than 50,000 and are areas around Duluth, East Grand Forks, La Crescent, Rochester, Moorhead, Mankato, and St. Cloud. If a project is located in one of these communities, it can potentially receive 7 points if it is within a quarter of a mile of a fixed route stop, or 4 points if it is within a half mile. An additional 4 points are also available if a project is within a half mile of an express bus stop or park and ride lot. For rural and small urban areas in Greater Minnesota, transit service types vary from community to community. If you are a community or developer working in these geographies, I highly recommend following the hyperlinks found in the location efficiency methodology that will take you to the previously mentioned Minnesota Department of Transportation's website, where you can find the transit service and type available for your project's location. 7 points are available in rural and small areas if a project is within a half mile of an existing or planned designated stop that has service every 60 minutes, within a half mile of a commuter rail station, or served by demand response dollar ride with same-day service. 4 points are available if a project is served by demand response dollar ride with a prior day notice. And finally, 2 points are available for demand response dollar ride service that doesn't meet the scheduling conditions in the higher aforementioned scoring categories. As mentioned previously, all regions under location efficiency can receive up to an additional 2 points for walkability. And walkability is based on the project's walk score, which can be found by going to walkscore.com. The threshold used for walkability varies from urbanized areas to rural and small urban areas. So if you were to take each geographic priority areas for the Twin Cities, 7-county metro area and combine their potential points, you will come up with the map currently on your screen. This is called a composite map. But please note that this map does not include the potential for additional 2 points for walkability. For Greater Minnesota, the composite maps look something like this. And I say something like this because the points for location efficiency in the rural and small urban areas is not included on this map. Again, that may represent an additional 2 to 9 points depending on the type of transit service available and the project's walkability. But as I mentioned, if you're in one of these areas, you certainly want to follow MnDOT's hyperlinks found in the location efficiency methodology, which is on our tax credit page of our website. You can go there and determine the transit service type and the number of points potentially available for your project. So these maps for the Metro and Greater Min can be found in the Community Profiles section of our website. So to access the data, just go to Minnesota Housing's main webpage and click Policy and Research at the top of the page. Then just below that and to the right, click Community Profiles. Below that and to the left, select Scoring for the 2020 RFP 2021 HTC. And then below, click Multifamily RFP Geographic Scoring Map. So now I will turn it over to the Multifamily Program Supervisor, Devin Pullman, to tell you about upcoming engagement opportunities for the 2022 QAP.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, William. We are really excited to announce a different approach and a different way that we are managing our public engagement process relative to our next Qualified Allocation Plan and the development of our QAP. As William noted in the earlier slides, the tax credit program is really foundational to both the production of new affordable housing as well as housing preservation. It is really our primary mechanism in Minnesota and nationally to be able to create and preserve these units. We are fortunate in Minnesota to have a number of other resources to help supplement and support additional housing work, including things like housing infrastructure bonds, but tax credits are foundational to being able to produce and preserve the units, affordable units that our communities so desperately need. Because our tax credit program, we continue to see oversubscription in the tax credit program, essentially meaning that we receive far more applications than we are able to fund through our consolidated RFP process. The pointing framework that William covered so well really is crucial and instrumental in order to determining which projects do rise to the top to receive an allocation of tax credits. As we develop that pointing and scoring framework, we want to make sure we are taking into account the requirements of the Internal Revenue Code that guides the tax credit program from a federal perspective. There's also the state statute that guides the tax credit program here in Minnesota. And then we want to make sure that our pointing criteria reflects the goals and priorities of our strategic plan. As a result of these things, we are working on earlier engagement as part of our Qualified Allocation Plan development process than we have historically. And so we are really targeting the months of January and February to really initiate and connect with communities, community partners, and a variety of stakeholders on things that are most important to them, including elements that are identified as priorities in our agency's strategic plan that we should be considering before we develop the QAP and the overall proposed initial draft scoring framework. Once we solicit this engagement and feedback from a variety of partners, we will then focus more internally on developing our first draft of the Qualified Allocation Plan and Scoring Framework. We expect to be able to release that in early summer. Yes, it will be summer someday in Minnesota. Sometimes it doesn't feel like that in January, but we know it will come. And from there will be the opportunity for formal public comments, as is per typical in this process on the draft QAP and Scoring Framework. That's typically a 30-day public comment process. There's usually another round of engagement that we will conduct at that point in time. And that will then inform a potential second draft QAP release as needed based on the feedback from those public comments that we receive that we would expect to then again release in late summer. All of this we anticipate will result in a final Qualified Allocation Plan that will be approved in the early fall. That QAP will then determine how we select and score project proposals that come in calendar year 2021 and that consolidated RFP. So we are working in advance to develop this Qualified Allocation Plan. Next, I want to highlight some policy areas that the agency is interested in early feedback on, and these are areas that we would really like your professional and thoughtful opinions, feedback, and ideas around. And these include things such as how can we best align government incentives, including the tax credit program, for the production and preservation of housing for populations that are not being adequately served by the current rental housing market. What's the right role and how can we best incentivize this, in particular in regard to the housing tax credit program, both 9% and 4% credits. Second area we are interested in early policy feedback on is how we can work to help serve communities most impacted by housing instability and housing disparities. We know that there are a number of communities that continue to face barriers to achieving successful housing and housing stability, and how can we use the tax credit program in particular to help ensure that we are reaching and prioritizing reaching those populations. Third, we're very interested in how we can create economic opportunities for communities that will benefit most from housing development work. We have points in our Qualified Allocation Plan right now for minority and women-owned business enterprises that are key members of the development team. We want to continue to emphasize and create pathways for minority and women-owned businesses and others that may be from underserved communities to have access to these economic opportunities that we know exist within the housing development framework. And how can we best do that, including that might include what we are doing today with regard to our maybe WEBE points. There may be other ideas that you have on ways we could further emphasize that and create even more powerful economic opportunities through the tax credit program. Fourth, we want to review the role of geography and what role that should play in helping to drive funding decisions around housing investment throughout the state. There are a number of ways our current Qualified Allocation Plan considers geography. Are those the right things? Are there amendments to some of those criteria that we should consider? Are there different ways we should think about geography? And what role should geography play in helping to drive our funding decisions in the tax credit program around this scarce resource? Fifth, how can we best continue to focus on ending homelessness in Minnesota? And what is the right role of coordinated entry in regard to that focus? Sixth, how can we best advance energy efficiency and building innovation in rental housing while ensuring cost reasonableness? And then last, how can we best achieve deeper and longer term affordability? We continue to see that the number and percentage of cost burden renters rise throughout the state and in many metro markets and MSAs throughout Minnesota. We want to make sure that the tax credit program is designed to help effectively reach lower income tenants to help alleviate some portion of the cost burden that we know many low income tenants and renters are facing. So these are areas that we want to actively invite your discussion, your thoughts, your feedback around as we begin kind of our early engagement around the Qualified Allocation Plan and how we could best tackle some of these issues through the tax credit program. There are a number of sessions and in-person opportunities that we have developed and ways we'd like to invite you to come and engage with us. We wanted to structure the opportunity to participate in this webinar first as kind of a kickoff to our engagement efforts, just to provide some foundational information and about the tax credit program, including some of these key policy areas that we're interested in your thoughts and feedback and creative ideas and solutions around. The first in-person opportunity will be at Minnesota Housing on January 28th, so that is next Tuesday. We invite you to come and sit down with us and have some discussion around some of those key policy priorities that we have outlined and are requesting further feedback on, or if you have other policy topics and ways you think the tax credit program could particularly well help advance a policy goal or a policy effort. So we would like to invite you to join us here at the agency for a discussion around those things. We are also going out around the state, and we will be in St. Peter on January 30th, Cloquet on February 5th, and Brainerd on February 10th. These statewide sessions in Greater Minnesota are designed to both provide an opportunity for engagement and feedback as it relates to the Qualified Allocation Plan and the development of that, as well as providing more resources and information and technical assistance from Minnesota Housing, a variety of funding partners, including Rural Development, the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, the Minnesota Housing Partnership, and DEED. Will be out at these sessions, and then there will also be opportunities to meet one-on-one for technical assistance sessions with Minnesota Housing staff. And then we also have a calendar for other technical assistance, or other engagement opportunities throughout the Metro. We will be partnering with Minnesota Housing Partnership on a session, with MCCD as well on a session. Those dates are announced. We're doing some tribal outreach at the Minnesota Indian Housing Directors meeting coming up in February. So there are a number of other opportunities for engagement that we have identified as well. If you would like to stay connected as we develop the 2022 QAP over the course of the next several months, there's a specific email address, and we will make sure we send these slides out after the webinar today so that you can click on hyperlinks and get to where you need to go easily. But we would invite you to actually sign up for QAP specific email updates so that, again, you can stay connected as we develop drafts, and then as we formally open up public comment periods, and then solicit additional feedback and engagement around any drafts of the Qualified Allocation Plan that we release. We do invite any comments or early feedback in writing. Those can be emailed to us. So if you are not able to participate in any of the in-person engagement sessions outlined on this slide or in the calendar, but would like to send us something to consider in writing at this early stage, we also want to make that opportunity available and invite you to do so as well. I do want to really emphasize that this approach really is designed to allow us to engage more broadly with our stakeholders and communities before we actually release a draft, so that we have time to really think thoroughly about some of these policy areas that we have heard from many of you that you have an interest in, as well as others that could potentially emerge from these discussions. And so it's a very intentional process to allow us the opportunity to really conduct this engagement with an open mind as we approach these conversations and ideas, and then to go back and do some internal work to draft what a new scoring framework and qualified allocation plan could look like as a result of some of the feedback we've gotten, and then really open that up for broader public comment. So it's a very different process than we've used in recent years here at the agency, and we really invite you to participate and come along with us on this journey. So with that, we're going to open it up to any questions that anyone has. We don't see any in the chat box right now. I know we are right at 2:30, but we will stay on for another 2 to 3 minutes. If we see any questions come in, we certainly invite you to let us know if you have any questions. You have William and my contact information on this slide. Summer Jefferson, we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge Summer's leadership in this area. She does supervise the tax credit team specifically, credit program specifically as well. So she's another great resource on the team. Please reach out to us at any time, and we look forward to engaging with you as we develop the next Qualified Allocation Plan. Again, we'll stay on the line for just another couple of minutes just in case we get any questions on the chat box, but we aren't seeing any. So we hope you found today's webinar to be of value and that you've had the opportunity to learn a little bit more about the tax credit program in Minnesota. Okay, we haven't gotten any questions back in, so we will just leave you with our contact information, invite you to reach out and connect with us as we move forward in the next several months, and look forward to your thoughts and ideas and any questions that you have. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.